Tonight's guest speaker, Dr. Jeff Carrier, is a professor emeritus of biology at Albion College and an adjunct research scientist at Mote Marine Laboratories Center for Shark Research. Dr. Carrier holds a PhD from the University of Miami and is a world-renowned authority on shark conservation and shark ecology. Tonight, he's going to tell us a little bit about a very long-term research project that he's been conducting in the Florida Keys, all about courtship and mating in nurse sharks. And you guys knew that already. So I am absolutely thrilled to welcome to a live audience, Dr. Jeff Carrier.
Thank you, Zach. Boy, it's scary. Real people out there. How exciting. This is really neat. I like to start any of these conversations by offering you an opportunity to leave. What we're going to be talking about tonight is some private matters. And we've been fortunate to be allowed in the bedroom of the shark. And I want to show you a little bit about that. But I will tell you that we will be looking at some very graphic footage. So you have the opportunity to leave now. That tells me a lot about this audience. So I want to tell you about an opportunity I've had over the course of almost 50 years of work in the Florida Keys, where I've been privy to some of the secrets of, I think, one of the more exciting species of sharks. I grew up in Jacksonville Beach, Florida, Northeast Florida. Grew up working mate on a charter boat as a kid, and I would run into nurse sharks occasionally while we were catching king mackerel and other things like that. And I developed a real attachment for these animals, and it has hung with me. I've never studied any other species of shark but nurse sharks. I've worked in the Florida Keys for the vast percentage of my research career. Started there as an undergraduate at the University of Miami after having transferred from Florida State. Any of you Gators in the audience, I'm so sorry. Zach, I think we've got maybe a little bit of an issue with this.
You're good.
Okay. In any case, we started out by looking at aging and growth in nurse sharks and extended this to look at what we thought would be some migratory behavior. Some of my colleagues kind of frowned on that. They thought that looking at a couch potato of sharks isn't going to tell you much about migration. I think maybe I might be able to change your opinions on that in just a bit. Okay. Why in the world are we talking about shark reproduction at a seminar series such as this? What are the values of knowing anything about shark reproduction? If we're going to talk about it, what should we discuss? What are the kinds of things that are important to know about shark reproduction? Well, I guess the first question is, are sharks in trouble? Now, you're probably a pretty savvy audience. You know that the answer to that is probably yes, for at least some species of sharks. So we need to define that. What are the sources of problems that sharks face? I think there'll be some who think that perhaps overfishing is one reason for this. Coastal urban development and habitat degradation. This part of the Indian River Lagoon, you know, we've been under insult for some time. And there's probably been some effects on sharks that we ought to look at a little closely. Changing climate affecting water temperature. I'm catching sharks in the Keys. I've never caught there before. And I've watched water temperatures change in the last 15 years to the point where in the middle of March, in the area that I work, I'm getting water temperatures at 85 degrees when they shouldn't be anywhere above 80 degrees. And I think it's having some effect on the movement of shark species. We know that birds are extending their ranges farther and farther north, and we know this to be the case for other species as well. I don't see why sharks should be immune from it. If overfishing is a problem, and I saw some of you nodding your head, perhaps some of you at home are in agreement that this could be something we need to look into. What do we do about it? Do we ban shark fishing altogether? I think that's impractical, unrealistic. Should we restrict fishing for certain species at risk? We tried that. I'm not sure that was a good approach. Should we limit the number, establish quotas for sharks? That's been done as well. Our National Marine Fisheries Service has been involved in this since the middle 80s to varying degrees of success. And I guess as a biologist, the question that I feel that we must we must ask is what information do we need to have in order to set realistic guidelines for how this fishery should operate? How do we keep populations sustainable? And how do we do this in such a way that fishers can still make a living off this? And the key here is the term sustainable, which is something we reach for in any fishery, and I'm not sure we achieve it in every fishery. So as a biologist and looking at this program, when it first established itself in 1983, the National Marine Fisheries Service said to commercial fishers, you're over exploiting certain groundfish resources. And there's some resources you're just overlooking, and sharks are one of those. If you tell a commercial fisher that there is a resource that's untapped, that has a potential market, these people are smart. They're going to develop a fishery, and they did so. The National Marine Fisheries Service launched into this without having a good deal of information on some of the life history parameters of sharks, and this turns out to be fairly critical. As a result, the fishery collapsed in 3 to 5 years. It's amazing. It's just absolutely unbelievable. And I think I can give you some reasons for why that occurred. One of the first pieces of information that we need to have is how fast do sharks grow? We knew nothing about this. We had some anecdotal information and some preliminary studies that gave us some growth rates, but we didn't really know too much about it. More importantly, how old do they have to be before they can reproduce? Now you can start seeing a trend here, I think, in some of this conversation. We need to know how fast they grow. We need to know something about their aging, because what we're going to try to get after is their reproductive capabilities. How many offspring do they reproduce? What age do they have to reach reproductive maturity? And we had very little information about this, especially for some of the commercially valuable species, like sandbar sharks, for example, a shark species we get offshore here. Well, to launch into this, I would rather quote you scientific literature, but Matt Hooper's kind of my idol, so I'll quote him instead. What we're dealing here was a perfect engine, an eating machine. It's really a miracle of evolution. All this machine does is swim and eat and make little sharks. That's all. You tell a reproductive biologist about making little sharks, and I'm all in. So we needed to know something about this. Because again, we've got a species that's growing very, very slow, that matures very late in its life. And we haven't really talked about the number of offspring that they produce, but they don't produce very many. Biologists would call this low fecundity. We'll just call it a low number of offspring that are produced. Well, so I guess appropriate feedback here, we're all of a sudden talk about how sharks make little sharks, and you can't hear me. How do sharks make little sharks? Well, most of what we know comes from nurse sharks. The study that I'm about to detail for you is the only systematic study of shark mating that's ever been done for any species anywhere in the world. Now, we have a great deal of information that comes from the captive world. The aquariums have been successful at mating a number of species in captivity. The big pelagic species, we can't even keep them in captivity. The bigger species seem to be restricted in their capability to mate. Smaller species, the bamboo sharks, some of the cat sharks and whatnot, very successfully mated in captivity. SeaWorld has had quite a program for years, and they've been able to do this. There has been some mating of nurse sharks observed in the Miami Seaquarium a long, long time ago. But some of the information that we were able to get suggests that the things that we see in captivity don't perfectly mimic what goes on in the wild. And I don't imagine that's a terrible surprise. So our study occurs in a place called the Dry Tortugas. This is a national park. I'm sorry, I am forced to work there every year. This is, well, you know, you got to do this. This is 78 miles due west of Key West. This is now a national park. Fort Jefferson lives here. Its construction was started in 1846. This was actually the last place that the Maine docked up, fueled up before it went to Havana. So quite a history in this particular area. This is obviously an aerial photograph of Garden Key and the fort, Bush Key, and then Long Key. This area here shown in this shoal is underwater, a little bit of breaking waves here. That's the area that we're going to talk about. That turns out to be an extremely important study site. This is what it looks like from another point of view. Now, strangely, this area has been known as a shark mating ground since at least 1860. There's a wonderful article in Harper's Magazine called Along the Florida Coast. And there's a story about ships tying up here in, at the fort and coming out here in their longboats, where the boatswain's mate would jump over and ride the back of the gato sharks, nurse sharks, another name for nurse sharks. And those of you that are Florida residents or down here continuously know that a hobby of some divers is to grab a nurse shark by the dorsal fin and ride it. Some of them ride it all the way into the emergency room. It's kind of exciting. This happens to be an area that is absolutely loaded with nurse sharks. And this is extremely shallow water here. This is less than 6 feet deep. This is a nurse shark in that area. These animals grow to huge lengths, and we'll take a look at some of them in a little bit better detail. Now, nurse sharks are pretty common in the shallow waters. If you're coming down to Florida for the first time, for example, you're new to our waters, haven't spent much time offshore, chances are if you see a shark, the first shark you're going to see is probably going to be a nurse shark. Now, if you're in the lagoon, maybe you'll see a bonnethead or a black nose or maybe a little blacktip. But nurse sharks are pretty common. Sometimes you go out in the morning and might have a little trouble getting to your boat. They're everywhere. They're pretty common, and they're very social animals. I suspect many of you who have been diving for a long period of time have come on these, perhaps in aggregations, as you see here. Now, we find them in near-shore waters, in other areas that are particularly like mangrove forests. And here's this is a juvenile. This one hasn't reached reproductive maturity yet. It's too small, and this one similarly. Again, socializing in these shallow waters, you'll recognize these as mangrove roots. A very common resident of the nearshore mangrove areas. Now, when they come into Tortugas, they come into extremely shallow water. And when we first saw this, we weren't really sure what was going on. The first encounter we had that suggested something unusual was going on occurred many years ago when I was running a program for young kids out of a summer camp in the Keys. We were over there, we were in a Boston whaler. The water is so shallow that I couldn't have my engine down, so I was pushing along the flats, and I heard this noise. I wasn't 100% certain what it was, and looked over to see a tail out of the water, slapping the water. And I thought, goodness, a small boat has come over there, it's run into an animal, and I could recognize a nurse shark tail from a distance. And I thought, it's been hit by a boat propeller and it's probably died. So I worked my way over there. As I got closer, I couldn't quite home in on what I was looking at. And finally, I got close enough to look over the side and saw not one, but two nurse sharks. And quite frankly, they were not in pain at all. And it turned out that this was a pair of mating nurse sharks. As we looked around this particular flat, I saw 4 other pairs simultaneously in this particular area. And that was the first hint of the value of this particular site as a potential mating ground. Now, when these animals come in, this is a female, and this animal is every bit of 9 to 9.5 feet long. I'll give you some data on when they reach sexual maturity, but they are not small when they're sexually mature. So this is a pretty huge animal. This is my research partner, a guy by the name of Wes Pratt, who worked for the National Marine Fisheries Service. He studied mating, or he studied reproductive behavior in blue sharks, mako sharks, and great whites. Yet he had never seen mating in sharks at all. So I invited him down one summer to go diving, and I said, oh, incidentally, I know where some sharks mate, so what do you think? So we began a program which lasted 25 years. Research colleagues, longer than a lot of marriages last. We are able to get into this shallow water and find these females who are resting on the bottom, often with their dorsal fins completely out of the water, their heads out of the water, only their gills and mouth underwater. Why? What is it about this behavior? This is very peculiar. Every single one of these animals that's in this shallow water is a female. There are no males to be seen, at least not at this moment. For some reason, these animals seek refuge in the shallow water. I'll try to reveal what we think is the reason for that shortly. Let's get here. Trying to give you some idea of what we're dealing with here in some of the pictures that you're going to see. Fertilization in sharks is internal. The males possess two reproductive structures called claspers. They are analogous to a mammalian penis. This has to be inserted into the female. Copulation will occur, fertilization theoretically to follow. Okay. This is what a clasper looks like. Now, this is an immature male nurse shark. As they mature, this becomes calcified and a little bit larger. And the female has a structure very similar to this. It's called a cloaca, and a clasper would be inserted into that, and sperm eventually pass from the male to the female. This is fertilization. Okay. Now, in order for this to occur, it takes some very particular alignment for that to happen. Having no arms, a male shark grabs a female by the pectoral fin, and alignment occurs in such a way that a clasper can be inserted into the female. Now, this is tricky. Okay. Yes. And there has to be, I want to be careful and not anthropomorphize here. There has to be a certain agreement on the part of the female for this to occur. If she is not willing to mate with that particular partner, she can go through a variety of moves which will throw the male off or prevent him from getting a proper bite, getting the proper alignment, and for mating to occur. Now, mating cannot occur in very shallow water. In fact, the minimum depth is about 50 centimeters. That's knee high on me. If she is on the beach and cannot be pulled into deeper water, mating will not occur. This may give you some hints as to why she seeks the shallow water. And if you're thinking in the back of your mind that this might be female selection, female mate choice, that's the conclusion we've come into. Now, female nurse sharks, just to set this up for you, are reproductively active 2 to 3 weeks every 2 years. Okay, so that's a very small window for mating to occur. During the first portion of this time, it appears that she's extremely selective. She'll go into shallow water and she will not allow herself to be taken to deeper water unless the right guy is there. Now, we don't know what guides that choice, but we're thinking that there is a social hierarchy, a dominance hierarchy among the males, and the females will recognize this. Now, let me just sort of go off the record here, a little aside. She is pretty selective for that first 10 days. Thereafter, not so much. Okay. Now, remember, you've got a 2 to 3 week window here. Natural selection favors getting it right. If you're going to be reproductively active every 2 years, just for 2 or 3 week period of time, mating has got to be successful for the line to continue. So if Mr. Right doesn't come along in that first 2 or 3 weeks, well, then dating becomes a little more promiscuous. This is what I saw. This is what it looks like from the surface. You see all this crazy bubbly water and you're not real certain what you're looking at until you get close. Please cover your eyes. This is what it looks like a little more close up. Now, I want to draw your attention to the size of this pectoral fin here. It's absolutely huge, and that has some ramifications for successful mating. Now, you can see here that the grip has been established and that a clasper has been inserted and the mating activities have begun. Now, I never quite understood Wes's interpretation of how we should structure ourselves to look at this mating. He was a reproductive biologist, and he was kind of concerned about the business end because we didn't know whether one clasper was used at a time or or how that worked. I mean, we were really novices going into this. 1991 when we first started this, and we weren't really certain what was going on. So he said, look, I'm the reproductive biologist. I really ought to be at the reproductive end. And therefore, you ought to be at the other end so that we can get some details on the grip, because we didn't really know much about the grip. Well, I thought that was a fine idea, and I didn't mind positioning myself up there. This whole activity is pretty violent, and this is a scarred up female that shows you just how much of this fin is damaged during this bite. Nurse sharks have teeth. They can do you in. So this gave me a little bit of pause being at the front end of this. I thought, well, we'll see what happens. I didn't want to wind up scarred like that. My pectoral fins are a little bit different shape. Well, this is what it looks like. I pointed out that scar because I want to point out the damage that can be done. This is the base of the pectoral fin on this particular female, and it is cut up pretty badly. And we've had some vets go with us in the field and have done some swabs on this and have found that they've actually been infected with Vibrio, which is a particularly potent problem. Nevertheless, they're obviously able to survive this. Now, for those of you who do some photography or some underwater photography, to give you a better sense of this, I use ultra wide angle lenses. This happens to be an 18mm lens. Now, if you don't know much about photography, telephoto allows you to get to a distance. Ultra wide angle lenses allow you to get very close. I'm sorry, I'm going off screen here. I'm shooting at a distance of this. Okay, I know I'm violating your space. Well, we're violating the couple's space as well. So just to give you an idea of how close you can get, oops. Here's a little bit closer picture. I have accidentally bounced my camera off of the business end here a couple of times. I'm a biologist, not a voyeur. I'm allowed to do this. I would like to point out to you the behavior of the pelvic fins on the female. This is a cupping behavior. And we believe this is a sign of acceptance on the part of the female because it does help guide the clasper. And in this particular case, the female has apparently made whatever choice the female makes to get this particular male engaged. Well, I'm going to see if we can make this happen. This is the mating activity. The male in this case was captured later and was measured at 10 feet, just to give you an idea of the size of the animals that we're working at. And a couple of things that I'll want you to observe beyond the obvious. Here's the cupping of the pelvic fins on the part of the female. She is not resisting, or what we would call resisting. Whatever choice she makes has been made to accept this particular male. Please note that this particular male is also carrying a tag. And this is mating in nurse sharks. Now, this footage has been featured on National Geographic and on Shark Week. We've done a total of 17 shows. Please look at the size of his pectoral fin and notice that he has the entire pectoral fin in his mouth. Now, if he has difficulty getting the proper alignment, and if a successful copulation cannot occur, often there's a time limit here. When he's choked up with that fin for so long, we think he actually becomes oxygen starved and will fall to the bottom and release his grip, and mating will not be successful. Now, one of the advantages of this particular study is that these animals during this particular moment are pretty vulnerable to capture, and we can capture them. There I am right at the front. Stupid. that are very vulnerable, and here's the tag. They're very vulnerable to capture. And so we can wait till this is done and then try to capture. And if we're able to, then this gives us the opportunity to do a variety of things to these animals that we wouldn't otherwise be able to do if we couldn't capture. We can tag them. We can take fin clips for DNA samples because we'd like to learn something about relationships down here. Is there a social hierarchy? Is there a dominant male? If we capture the young after a successful mating, can we determine whether or not there is some sort of dominance, whether or not many of the pups show up from the same father, same mother, this kind of information. We also have been working with some vets. So we take blood samples. We know nothing about the reproductive endocrinology. So we're studying the reproductive hormones in this particular study, hopes that we can learn something about that. So capture is a pretty easy kind of a thing to do. And we put all kinds of tags in. We have tried everything you can imagine, from pop beads to National Marine Fisheries Service tags. We finally settle on cattle ear tags. These are roto tags. You can go up to any of our local communities where the cattle are raised and stop at Tractor Supply and you buy yourself some rotor tags and go out and tag your own nurse sharks. These are nice because they show up from a distance. They're numbered and they're colored. So we're able to determine something about who we're dealing with. And from that, who's dating who. So we can establish some sort of patterns, we hope. And we also put ultrasonic transmitters on these animals, and we have receivers all around the Tortugas. But in recent years, we use, almost all of us who study and track animals use the same kind of receivers. They're all over the coast of Florida, all around the coast of Florida, all through the Keys, around the Gulf Coast, and even up on the East Coast. And if one of our sharks carrying a tag like this hits one of those receivers, the code for each one of these tags is unique. And if we get a hit from Jupiter, if we get a hit from Bimini, if we get a hit from Sarasota or Tampa, those investigators who belong to those particular receivers will let us know. And that way we get a better way to track our animals. This will allow me to revise this whole notion of the nurse shark as couch potato here momentarily. Another thing to point out is that when this mating occurs, it often occurs in groups. We're not really certain what's going on here, but it does raise the specter of a group behavior. On many, many, many occasions, we have seen a male attempting to grasp a female, and we've seen other males nearby. Often we'll see a male in front of the female. If she tries to rise from the bottom, the male will rise with her and block her. If she tries to swim away, the male will move in front of her and prevent her from moving away. Now, often these are subadult males, and some of our colleagues have hypothesized that perhaps we're looking at a learning behavior. E.O. Wilson, a biologist of some renown, wrote a book called Consilience, a wonderful book. And he hypothesized there that the only vertebrate group that didn't show any altruistic behavior were elasmobranchs. These are the sharks, skates, and rays. Well, I had the opportunity to host Mr. Wilson, Dr. Wilson, for some time. And I arranged to have a little bit of time in my office, and I showed him some of the other video that showed this blocking behavior. And he looked at it and he said, "Could I see it again? Could I see it again? Could I see it again?" I wound up showing him this about 6 times, and I mentioned to him that we had a group of students who had read the book Consilience. I said, "We noticed in there that you omitted elasmobranchs as showing altruistic behavior. What do you think?" And Dr. Wilson, who unfortunately has passed away this last year, said, "I suspect there's a need to rewrite that chapter because what we were seeing looked remarkably like species altruism." Now, this is saying Just to put it in simple terms. Maybe I won't be successful. Maybe I won't be the one to successfully mate, but for the good of the species, I've got to see that it happens. It's a short period of time, a very narrow reproductive window, and there might be some advantage in assisting with mating in such a way that it becomes successful during this window. So we could sit here and debate this for hours. If Zach had provided some beer and wine and refreshments, I could see this going on for hours, and we could argue this back and forth. I pointed out before that these tags were in place and mating still occurs. There would be those who would criticize the placement of tags and wonder if it doesn't interfere with normal behavior. Well, I think my answer to that is no, it doesn't. I've seen too many animals carrying tags mating. And if that isn't enough for you, this is a critter cam, okay? This thing's the size of a Volkswagen, and you put it on the dorsal fin of a shark and turn it loose. Within 15 minutes of turning a female shark loose, wearing a critter cam this size, the critter cam captured a mating attempt. When we put this on a male, same thing happened, except the male got thrown into a coral head and knocked the camera off. But we don't think that anything that we attach to this animal can get in the way of the power of this reproductive drive. No matter how much bling you put on these animals, they're going to mate. Hopefully, they're going to mate. Well, I guess the logical question is: we know something about the mating. What are the next steps for this? What do we need to find out? Well, I guess if you're a shark, you don't really care. You know, you've mated, and hopefully, you're going to have a bunch of little young, and life is going to be good and good for them. We know that the size of nurse shark egg is gigantic. These are unfertilized eggs. Here's a ruler to give you an idea that you're dealing with something that's 3 to 4 inches long. Here's Wes with one in his hand. It's about the size of a tennis ball. These things are gargantuan, and that opens some opportunities for us. One of these opportunities involves the use of ultrasound. We thought that we got some information about mating in the field. We know when they were mating. We can narrow it. I can tell you within 24 hours of when it's going to occur to dry tortugas. Pretty good at that. I can tell you about when it's going to end. But then the animals swim off. What next? What happens? I mean, that's not Paul, with all respect to Paul Harvey, you know, that's not the rest of the story. We need to know a little bit more about this. And so we thought that maybe, just maybe, we might be able to take some of these animals and hold them in captivity throughout the pregnancy to get some idea of how long they were pregnant, something about the number of offspring they give, and some other information that might be useful to us. So we took some vets from SeaWorld into the field and did some ultrasound on these females. Now, the guidelines for us, we were going to capture these animals, try to take them back to SeaWorld and pump them out. But the guidelines for us, we had to know that there was a possibility that they could be pregnant. So that means that we would capture animals who we saw mating and who we thought had gone to completion, and therefore the possibility was very high that they could be pregnant. All right, so we filmed the mating, we know who they were, we captured them right at the end of mating, and then we took them back to the ship. We had a research vessel that allowed us to hold these animals on board long enough to be able to do an ultrasound. And when you do an ultrasound, this is, I got to tell you, this is black magic as far as I'm concerned. If I ever had kids and the doctor gave me an ultrasound, it's like voodoo magic to me. I can't decipher this. But these are egg cases that are inside a nurse shark. Now, we don't know if they're fertile or not. We just know there are egg cases in there. And you go a little bit further, this is a juvenile nurse shark. Okay? Now, this is a marker that measures length. This is not the vertebrae in here. The eye is up in this area. This is a dorsal fin. You can see it kind of floppy here. So pretty good chance. In this case, we know the animal's pregnant. This is a late stage ultrasound. Here's the tip of the snout. Here's the eye socket, dorsal fin. I guess I could consider myself a proud papa of this, but I got to have something a little bit more visual. This is a developing embryo on top of an egg. Here, just to give you some idea of what we're dealing with and the size of the animals that we're dealing with. Well, for me, I'm very visual, and it's got to be something I can see. So ultrasound was a good technique. We really liked ultrasound, but as far as I'm concerned, getting a view from inside the shark using some sort of camera equipment was a better way. So we used the process of endoscopy. Unfortunately, I'm looking out here and thinking to myself, the age of this audience probably knows altogether too well what endoscopy is. I'm imagining some of you at home have had similar experiences. Well, we're able to use a laparoscope, an endoscope, and actually feed it into the uterus of a nurse shark. They're paired uteri in sharks, by the way. And this is what we saw after we'd been holding this animal. This is a hatched nurse shark. Oops. Obviously the eye, you can see the scales here. This is actually the uterine lining. And in nurse sharks, these eggs that you saw develop internally. 2 to 3 weeks, we think, before the young are born, the eggs hatch internally. The egg cases are somehow expelled, and then 2 to 3 weeks later, the young are born live. And so we're within a week or so, probably, on this particular animal when we got this photograph. We actually took some video, and you can hear the shrieking in the background. This is the first time endoscopy had ever been tried on a live and pregnant nurse shark. Grant Gilmore, who many folks would know, who's been a long time researcher on this coast, has done some work with sand tiger sharks a long time ago. They were dead when he did the endoscopy, but it looked like a perfectly good tool to use, and we were able to use it successfully with the nurse sharks. So in looking at these slides and at the comments I made, summarize, what have we learned? Well, nurse sharks grow slowly. I mean, they really grow slowly. They're pupped, they're a foot long, and they grow 4 to 6 inches per year. Start doing the math on that. This takes these animals a pretty long time to get big. All right. Well, they got to get big. Males mature at about 6.5 feet long. Okay, and they're growing 1/3 to 1/2 foot a year. All right. Females have to be 7.5 feet long. There's some nice sized sharks out here in the pond if you haven't had a chance to see them. Some nurse sharks. They may be sexually mature. They may not be. Okay. Zach reports to me that there's been some mating behaviors observed out here and some egg cases, so there's hope. Well, if you do the math on this, it suggests that nurse sharks need to be somewhere between 18 and 20 or 22 years of age before they can reproduce. Now, imagine, if you will, if the nurse shark was a target of a commercial fishery. What would the possibilities be of it surviving to maturity to reproduce? And this harkens to a problem we got into with some of the other species of sharks. We had no idea how fast they grew. We didn't know anything about the onset of sexual maturity, and we didn't know how many offspring they had. And yet we targeted them as a commercial fishery. And that may explain why the fishery collapsed so rapidly. Okay, or at least it's one explanation. By keeping these animals in captivity, we also determined that they're pregnant for about 4.5 to 5 months. Okay? We were able to pup them out in captivity successfully. And incidentally, for those of you who are interested in this sort of thing, mom and the pups were taken right back to Tortugas and turned loose. And darndest thing, we turned mom loose in the Tortugas. Okay, she'd been through her reproductive year. So they disappeared the next year, and she turned up right on schedule for her next reproductive cycle. So you can do a lot of things to nurse sharks and get away with it and not interfere with their natural history. And we're pretty excited about that, because, you know, we lose our living if we're damaging the reproductive potential of our study animals and whatnot. Like not to do that. And again, the females reproduce every 2 years at best, and perhaps even longer than that. We have some evidence of some animals that may be on a 3-year cycle. So that's a long time, especially when you consider that litter size is so small, 24 to 40 pups or so. 40 is an outside. size. I've seen litters of between 20 and 30 most common. So 20 to 30, now that doesn't say anything about infant mortality and post-birth mentality. We don't really know what that is, but 24 to 30 every 2 years, that seems like unsustainable. Again, we think much of what we've done with the nurse shark probably serves as a template for other species, but other species may not be identical. So it's unfair to draw complete conclusions from just one species. Okay, extraordinary as it might be. I mentioned and used the term promiscuity. I saw some eyebrows go up in my live audience. I wish I could see you at home. Female will make her choice during the first week to 10 days of this 2 to 3 week period. Thereafter, she's not so selective. If you think about it, I've suggested to you that nurse sharks don't move very much. Okay, so their populations are fairly small and they don't range too far. If there are dominant males, what's the risk here? If you have a dominant male, the possibility of good genetic diversity isn't there. But if you have multiple males, chances for genetic diversity in a small population that doesn't move too much, it's pretty good. So multiple males is a good strategy. By the way, we thought that there were a few species that demonstrated multiple paternity. It looks like that may be the rule, not the exception. So sharks have exploited every possible reproductive avenue that's available to them. If we had enough time, we'd even go into parthenogenesis. Big term for the fact that some shark females have been given birth and they've never been around a male. Okay, I gotta work on that one sometime. All right. Well, there are some remaining questions. Yeah, I see a question coming. There are some other questions, however. Are these behaviors unique to nurse sharks? Are there physiological attributes that we've seen in the Keys for so long? Are they typical of all nurse sharks? Or do we have a unique population in the Tortugas? Are the Keys and the Indian River Lagoon populations separate? It's possible they could have drifted genetically. Bahamian population's different? I don't know the answer. Is there genetic overlap? Do other inshore shallow areas get used for reproduction, or is that unique to the Keys? Now, a diver of some renown, Noreen Rausch, who was out of West Palm Beach a long time ago, a veteran diver and very highly respected in the diving community, photographed some mating nurse sharks at 130 feet. So we do know that they can reproduce at depth. They can reproduce in shoal water, in shallow water. So what's the rule here? Where are the nursery areas? I mean, for all the work we've done in Tortugas, over 25 years worth of work, 2 neonates, 2 babies. That's it. That's all we've ever found. Now, there's a lot of coral down there and some nice reef structure, 70 feet, good structure. And this could be pontificating a little bit, but Zach will forgive me. There is a huge population of Goliath grouper in this area. And I have personally witnessed Goliath grouper eating baby nurse sharks. So I'm not as sympathetic toward this large fish as others might be. What's the role of habitat? If it's critical habitat, how can it be protected? The area in the Tortugas where we worked is set aside as a marine protected area. The strongest advocates for this were not the biologists, not the Park Service personnel. They were commercial fishers, representative of OFF, the commercial fishing lobby for the state of Florida, who went with us and are always on the side of preserving a strong ecosystem, and sharks as apex predators belong in that system. So this was able to occur because of their involvement. And again, this is in a national park, so you have some expectations of setting sites aside, and we're pretty happy with this. And I guess to extrapolate to other species, is this mode of reproduction and this activity that we see in nurse sharks, is this typical of other species? Or is the nurse shark unique and very different? So if sharks grow slowly, and it takes many years for them to mature, and they produce very few offspring, or they do so on a multi-year cycle. There's some species of sharks that we know to be 3 to 5 year cycles. And if they don't have many pups, then we know we're in trouble. How could this possibly influence commercial fisheries if they have these reproductive characteristics? And how do we take that into account when we try to establish realistic practices for taking sharks? I don't know the answer to this. I don't know that the commercial fisher knows the answer to this. I don't think other biologists do. I'm pretty certain resource managers make a good attempt at this, but I'm not sure they're 100% successful. This is a tough area to get at because we need to protect the resource. We need to protect the individual's right for recreational or commercial fishing. And I don't know where you find a balance point here. It's tricky. So what about other species? We know a lot about nurse sharks. What do we know about other species? And more importantly, how does the Indian River Lagoon factor into all this? Well, there's been a great deal of work done on the IRL with regard to sharks, skates, and rays. As I mentioned, elasmobranch species. Here are just a few papers that have been done by some folks who have been involved in this for a long period of time. This is a rich area. The fauna, the elasmofauna, the sharks, skates, and rays, this area is diverse and it's rich. You've probably seen some rays as you've gone, and certainly some out here. From spotted eagle rays, cow-nose rays, and yellow stingrays, and just all kinds of things out here. It's wonderful. Bringing my boat into, I have some docks up in Sebastian. I came in the other day, I came across 5 spotted eagle rays just leading me right in. So I powered down and just kind of pulled the boat in just to watch them. They're magnificent. They're fully protected in Florida waters. They're just gorgeous. And it's nice to see these animals in high numbers. We also get sawfish. These are endangered throughout their range, worldwide. And there was one just taken up in Melbourne not too very long ago. So they're still around. And it's exciting to think about it. And it just makes the work of centers like this so very important when we are trying to deal with recovery of a challenged ecosystem, and trying to preserve some of the most important elasmobranch species that we have in this area. We've got a lot of different species of sharks in this area as well. We have lemon sharks in here. And we got black tips. So you know the migration of black tips up and down the coast. I mean, this is a popular area. Steve Kajira, who works out of Florida Atlantic, flies over this area all the time, filming the black tip migrations. You have to have seen some of this on TV. And has Steve been here? Yeah, of course he has. I've known Steve since he was an undergraduate at the University of Hawaii, so we go back a long way. I've had the opportunity to fly with Steve, and it's a lot of fun. Flying at 500 feet, looking up at condominiums is a disconcerting experience. And we've got black nose. These are all over the place. They're a pretty common species. You may have caught them, and bonnet heads and some of these others. Best known elasmobranch, without a doubt, is a bull shark. They're here in large numbers. They've been studied in the Indian River Lagoon for a long period of time. There's a gajillion papers on this. We know this is a pupping ground. We know it's a nursery ground. Some good studies have been done on that. We're not so sure about whether or not it's a mating ground. This is some of the work that we're involved in. There's studies that have been done through time, all on bull sharks, the food habits, the population, the seasonal distribution. It's starting to get just a tad warm. So we're starting to see some animals coming in through Sebastian Inlet, some of these big kind of bulbous females. And we're setting some lines, trying to do some sampling in that area to try to get some idea of the population of these animals. We'd like to do some ultrasound. We'd like to do some endoscopy, and we'd like to have both hands and feet intact when we're done with these studies. So bull sharks have a bad reputation. It is totally deserved. And I'm not a particular fan of working with them, but I have some questions that I'd like to have answered. So we've begun some studies to try to get at some of those. So here are the questions that we're going into this study with. We have to work with a lot of other agencies, a lot of other universities and research institutions to try to get some answers to these questions. You know that the environmental insults that have hit the Indian River Lagoon lately have made life in the lagoon a challenge. If you're a seagrass, good luck. The things that depend on it, good luck. What's the influence of freshwater on nurseries, particularly for bull sharks? Bull sharks are known to penetrate long distances of fresh water. A number of years ago, back in the 1930s, an individual working for the Illinois Fish and Game was brought a fish to identify. Guy was out for sturgeon or something like that, and brought a great big fish into the docks to have identified. It's a bull shark. Okay, this is over 1,000 miles up the Mississippi River. So these animals are known to penetrate the Zambezi River, Lake Nicaragua, the Mississippi River. Yes, bull sharks can tolerate fresh water. One of the few shark species that can. Is this a mating ground? We know it's a nursery ground, but is it a mating ground as well? And how has the habitat changes that we've seen over the past couple of decades affected other elasmobranch species? There are good studies going on at Harbor Branch. There are great studies going on at FIT. And all of these are attempts to look at the shark, skate, and ray population in this area to determine just what changes have occurred. Now, there is some hope. I hope it's not false hope that some changes to the runoff from Lake Okeechobee, both to this coast and to the Caloosahatchee, will be changed in the course of the next decade. I don't know if a decade's going to help us here, but it's better than no hope, I suppose. And this is what we're after. This is the name of the game. This is a baby nurse shark. This is where we've got to wind up. Everything that we're geared to do in our study is to try to improve the numbers of these animals that we can find, whether it's marine protected areas, whether it's wise and strategic conservation measures. And then more importantly, how does any of this work extrapolate to other species, particularly those that have some commercial value? And is it wise to think that what we've learned from a nurse shark can be applied to other species? I think some parts of it, but certainly not all. A nurse shark is a very slow grower. Other commercially valuable species do grow faster and mature sooner and have better outlooks on the number of offspring that they produce. But we're going into this with extreme optimism in hopes that some changes can occur. One of my colleagues is Jill Morris, who was with me before she finished her undergraduate work back in the early 2000s. And she now has an organization called Sharks for Kids, which is a great group for if you have any grandkids or young kids of your own. This might be a good place for them to look. Jill and her husband, Duncan Brake, and another good friend of mine, Andy Murch, contributed some of the photographs to this, and also a book I wrote with them. So it's kind of a fitting way to conclude by giving you a little nurse shark kiss here, and, in hopes that you'll respect these animals as much as I do, and perhaps hope that we can get some answers for other species in as detailed a manner as we have for nurse sharks. So give you a little bit of time for some questions.
Awesome, Jeff. Thank you so much. What a cool program. What's that noise? We haven't heard the applause in 2 years. So, folks, what we'll do, we'll start with you guys in the audience. We're happy to have you answer our audience questions first, and then I see you guys online as well asking questions away. Go ahead, for those of you watching on Zoom, start typing some questions into that box. I already see a bunch of them flowing in. And we'll just alternate back and forth. We've got a little bit of time here for a real nice Q&A session.
Yes, sir.
I think I heard you mention that nurse sharks have 2 uteruses.
Yes, paired uteri. Yes,
And-
most species of sharks do.
And what is the physiological function of that? Do they both contain fertilized eggs?
In some species, yes. In some species, one uterus is generally used at a time. Nurse sharks use them both. I left a picture out here of a necropsy of a gravid nurse shark we took that has 12 embryos in both sides, quite a large number there. Other species may only have one offspring at a time. There's all kinds of unusual behaviors going on in the uteri of sharks, including cannibalism, including individuals that have started development, and as other eggs are produced, they consume those eggs for nutrition, never giving them the opportunity to develop. So there are pretty bizarre strategies going on. Yes, ma'am.
Well, do you know what the ratio of male to female nurse sharks is
In pregnancy or overall?
overall?
I have no idea. No idea whatsoever. We get a pretty equal distribution down in Tortugas during the seasons that we study. But if you were to choose to go down there in October, for example, now mating is occurring in June and July. In October, we still find these animals in the Tortugas. We find them in shallow water, less than 2 meters deep, less than 6 feet deep. I have photographs of 60 to 70 at a time in an area about the size of this room. They're all females, every single one of them. So if you were to take an inventory then, you'd say, 100%. We think what's going on is those waters are pretty warm. And we think the females are actually coming into that shallow water, using the warm water to accelerate gestation. Because we don't see males in there. Females, whatever attractant they're producing, they no longer produce. We think there are pheromones involved, and we think they're produced for the 2 to 3 weeks of activity, and then they cease. So the males are no longer around. Females stay there.
So we've got such a big audience online right now. They've got lots of questions. So if you guys don't mind, I'm going to pop a few online questions in, and then we'll circle back to our in-person audience. So one of our online guests is marveling at this set of pictures of you in the water surrounded by sharks, and they're wondering, did you feel comfortable, and why didn't they seem to bother you?
Good question. I go back to the very first time we got in the water. We were actually on Garden Key at the lighthouse, and we could see this activity from Garden Key. So we jumped in a small boat, we paddled over there, and our rules of engagement here were that once we got in the water, we had some video cameras, we would turn them on. We would never turn the video cameras off until we were through. So we swam through this enormous cloud of silt. We broke out on the other side, and there were sharks everywhere. It was a mating pair, and then there were several sharks around that pair. We were later to learn that most of them were subadults. We didn't know what to expect, but we needed to get going on this and figure out what was going on. They didn't look, I don't know how you tell a shark looks like it's aggravated, but they did look aggravated. So we started following the pair. We had 3 of us who were working together. I had dove with Wes quite a lot. One of the other people that worked with us was a woman by the name of Linda Martin. She was the educational director at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. I'd never dove with her. I didn't know how intrepid she was. And so Wes was in there with a video camera. Linda and I were away. She kept bumping into me, pushed her back and trying to get I was using a still camera, hit me again. I bumped her and pushed her away. And I saw her over there. And I had been pushing away a male nurse shark behind. We went into this not knowing what to expect, but later we're to find out that they're pretty intent on successful mating, and they are not seemingly bothered by us. Now, when they break up, when the mating is over, being in front of them sometimes isn't a wise idea. A lot of scratches on my dome port of my camera housing where I've been bumped by them, but we've never been attacked.
That's a good lead into our next question. That male obviously was interested in you. What do you think a female nurse shark is looking for in an attractive male? Do you have any idea what drives them to pick a certain male?
Zach, I have a hell of a time with human females, much less trying to figure out, what would attract a female nurse shark to a particular male. We think we see a dominance. One male that we saw the first several years we were out there, the whole top of his fin was gone. And so his name was Notch. Now, Notch would have had to been 18 to 22 years of age before he could reproduce. Well, we've seen notch for 30 years. It tells you that a nurse shark might live as long as 50 years. I don't know what she saw in notch is beyond me. I don't know what guides the choice. Is it a social hierarchy? Is she relegated to make a choice such as we see in some primates, or I don't have any idea.
Do the males bite into either pectoral fin equally, or do they prefer a left or a right? Is there any handedness in this biting of pectoral fins? Another online question. Our Zoom audience.
That's a great question. The answer to that is we tried to keep score once, but we really got distracted by too many other questions, and we were curious not only about what fin they prefer, but I don't know how to quite phrase this, but are they right claspered or left claspered? Questions that a biologist would ask. I don't know the answer to that. I'm sort of proud of that, but I don't know the answer to it.
All right. Another online question. We've got lots and lots of questions from our Zoom audience, so I apologize. I'm going to take over for a minute, guys. Do the male sharks ever die from a lack of oxygen while they're holding onto the female's pectoral fin?
We've never seen one die, but in that very first event that I described to you, this event worked its way over to a coral head in the area that we were studying, and the pair went down to the bottom. He had a good grip, but never could get the alignment. And then all of a sudden, the male nurse shark is like this, and then he falls to the bottom. He lets go of the grip. He falls to the bottom. He falls on his back and just laid there on the bottom, just respiring. Now, we counted the respirations, and we attempted to compare those to natural respiratory rates to see if he was overventilating or something happened. We never did get any definitive data, but seeing this guy just collapse is what first drew us into this whole notion of not being able to ventilate. Now, just a piece of shark biology. Many of you are probably aware that almost all species of sharks have to swim to breathe. They keep their mouth slightly agape. It's called ram ventilation. It brings in a current of water across the gills. Few species have developed a pump that can actually pump water into the mouth, through the mouth cavity, and across the gills. The nurse shark is one of those species. A lemon shark can do it, a bull shark can do it, and several other species. So a nurse shark can sit on the bottom and ventilate. So it wouldn't be a matter of not being able to swim through the water to be able to do that.
So we have another Zoom question from our online audience. Can you relate any of your findings with nurse shark reproduction to pelagic shark reproduction? It seems like their sharp teeth would cause a lot more damage to fins than in the case of the nurse sharks.
So there's no doubt of it. Some of the photographs that have been returned of even white sharks, white sharks have enormous teeth, and blue sharks and makos as well. Some of the pictures that have been brought back of not only pectoral fins, but also bites on the back, dorsal fins, mistakes get made, show some savage wounds. Now, one point of protection for a female, for example, one of Wes's studies with blue sharks showed a tremendous difference in skin thickness in the females. A female blue shark might have skin that's 1/4 of an inch thick. Now, a nurse shark, pardon the noise, this is a mouse pad. Okay, it's about half the thickness of a nurse shark skin. We can't put a dart tag in a nurse shark. We have to capture a nurse shark and use a scalpel and actually open an incision to put a tag in because their skin is so thick. A surgeon who would oversee any of our work or would happen to be on it would absolutely just die if they saw how we handle a scalpel. You know how a scalpel is, not with us, it's like this, and try to saw with it. It's disgusting to watch, but it's the only way you can make an incision to get a dart type tag in. One of the reasons why we use a roto tag is not only its visibility, but we also can use a leather punch to punch a hole in there, and then just a plain old cattle ear tag. Thank you, Tractor Supply.
We still have over 150 people watching live on Zoom, but I hope you don't mind, guys. We're going to flip back to our live audience, and we'll take a few more local questions here in our audience.
Thanks for a very informative lecture. I met Rory Rice, by the way. I know with her I rode my first turtle with her.
Oh, my goodness.
Question.
You're older than you look, sir.
Yeah.
No offense.
Been a few years ago. Question. You mentioned it takes 4 or 5 months inside an egg. And then they come out as a live pup, you're calling them, a live shark. What is the average amount of births? How many pups are usually speeded out?
24 to 40 is a number that's often cited. Most of the litters I've seen have been between 20 and 30.
Okay.
Now, this is one of the studies that we currently have underway with some of the vets at SeaWorld. Is if you think about this, reproduction is occurring over 2 to 3 weeks. Okay, so the first male fertilizes a group of eggs that are coming down, and then another male with another group of eggs, and another male with another group of eggs. So if we actually got to a female and we're able to look in the uterus, would we see those that are closest to being born farther back in the uterus and those that are newly fertilized? They're definitely at different developmental stages. I've seen cases of animals that are clearly very ready to be pupped. They have no yolk sac on them at all. It's all been absorbed. But animals farther up the uterus have this great big yolk sac that they absorb. They get their nutrients from that, and then when it's totally absorbed, then they're born. So we're looking at the sequence of development here. That's going to be a tricky study. We'd like to do that with animals that are alive. But it doesn't look like it's going to happen. I'm fortunate in some ways, and I have a couple of commercial fishermen in the Keys who they were long liners and whatnot. If they would get a nurse shark on a line that didn't make it, they would call me. And so I could go get the animal and put it to use. I could take the tissues that I needed. I could take other tissues and send them around the country to other biologists. And that saves me having to sacrifice an animal. I never really liked doing that. But those are some of the questions we're still trying to. Good question. Yes, sir.
Does fertilization occur immediately, or can the female carry the sperm for a period of time?
Oh, man, what a
before
question.
fertilization occurs?
Sperm storage, what you're getting at. We don't know the answer in nurse sharks. Some sharks actually package sperm in little rice grain-like packets called spermazuma, and the sperm stay viable for a long period of time. There's one species in particular that it's a deep water species. The males produce these sperm packets. Mating occurs, and it's estimated that in this particular species, those packets are functional after 2 years of storage. Oh no, it gets better. The gestation period in this shark is 3 years. Mating, you're pregnant for 5 years, basically. Unusual strategy. You're talking about sperm viability, and we don't know the answer to that. There are a lot of different theories that subsequent matings could actually wash out any sperm that are there. In the nurse shark, the eggs are produced in the ovary. They come down the reproductive tract till they reach what's called the oviducal gland. This is the eggshell gland. They got to be fertilized before they get there, because once the eggshell is around, they can't be fertilized. So the sperm have to be up there and fertilize the egg before it makes the egg gland. Well, that's about all we know. I wish we knew more. That's a tough question. It's a good one.
I'm going to jump back in with some questions from our online viewers that fit this same line of questioning. So if a female nurse shark mates with multiple males, is it possible for the offspring to have multiple fathers?
Oh, of course, multiple paternity, absolutely. We've documented 4 to 6 fathers. We've looked at 5 different litters, each having between 20 and 30 offspring. And in every case, the genetics returned 4 to 6 different fathers. So yes, multiple paternity. And again, just to reemphasize, that's great for genetic diversity. Now, let me tag on something here. I mentioned couch potatoes. I mentioned this species not being too migratory. Let me walk that back a little bit. We published a paper last year that showed that some of our nurse sharks tagged in Tortugas with ultrasonic transmitters were picked up off Sarasota, Tampa, and St. Pete. So that's good. We thought that was great. We have some colleagues in Bimini who tagged some nurse sharks with ultrasonic transmitters in Bimini. Okay. They were picked up on receivers in Jupiter. Oh no, it's better than that. Then they were picked up again back in Bimini. Now this must have terrified a nurse shark. Crossing the Gulf Stream, not being able to see bottom, are you kidding me? So these animals are a little more movement inclined than we once thought. They are not couch potatoes. Thank you very much.
And then let's look at the other side of that coin. One of our guests caught your mention of parthenogenesis, and they said, can you speak more about that?
There have been a couple of aquaria that have reported having females in captivity for 3 to 5 years, never having been exposed to males at all, and they've given birth. Now, these are some smaller species. I think they are cat sharks. Cat sharks is a very wide category, viewer might know. Unusual, but again, it's a strategy. Sharks have been around 350 to 400 million years. And most evolutionary biologists are thinking that they've tried every reproductive strategy that's been known in the vertebrate world at one time or another. Parthenogenesis is interesting. I'm not sure I'm a fan. Again, genetic diversity, well, not for that reason. Genetic diversity is a challenge under those conditions. So that's another good question. Yes, sir.
Oxygen levels in the water, would that have any bearing on the, they seem to be quite shallower water?
Not in our area. We take a special meter with us called the YSI meter. It measures salinity, temperature, pH, dissolved oxygen. And we see our numbers are remarkably constant. Now, a caveat to that, that's true for the most part, but that one flat that I showed you, the long key area, that water temperature will get in the summer months between 95 and 98 degrees Fahrenheit. That's roasty toasty, and warm water holds less oxygen. But I think that the level is not crucial, is not critical to a nurse shark being able to breathe. And most of the time there's fair wave action in there, so the oxygenation is pretty good. It's only on extreme low tides that we get temperatures like that. Yet surprisingly, one of our biggest worries, and I know you'll think this is absurd, but we jump in the water at sunrise and we come out at sunset. We wear skins. We're in the water the whole time. We've gotten hypothermic before. You've been in the water for that long. I mean, I've come out of the water, color of her blouse is blue, just, and it's scary. I mean, you're coming out and you're shaking like this. You put your skin up like that, it tense, a good sign of dehydration, and 98-degree water. How's that work out? Other questions from the audience here? Yes, ma'am.
Over these 25 years, have you observed a decline in, or is the numbers of sharks that you observed it pretty consistent over that time?
In the Tortugas, it's been pretty consistent, but there's probably several reasons for that. It's a national park. It's a rich environment. Boy, is it loaded. Nurse sharks do not have a commercial value at all. I mean, there used to be stories, anecdotal and never verified, that some people would spear them and use them for crab trap bait. I was never able to verify that. I don't think that's true. I don't think they're particularly good. If Jeff Weekly is watching, I'm sorry to say this, sir, but Florida Sportsman once said that nurse sharks were among the best tasting inshore fishes available. So I don't agree with that, but shark, when prepared properly, is pretty good. I can't bring myself to eat my experimental animal. They seem to be remarkably stable down there. I'm not sure that's the case in the Keys. I just got back from 3 weeks down there, and at a time when I should be catching a lot of juvenile sharks. I caught some big nurse sharks, but the juvies, 2- and 3-year-olds, didn't see a one. So I don't know. I've got a lot more data to be gathered down there. I have to go back to the Keys, I guess.
That sounds terrible. Well, we'll loop back to some of our Zoom questions since we have so many of them. Do sharks ever get together for any purposes other than reproduction? You know, do they get together for something non-reproductive, or are all these gatherings always about reproduction?
Well, some species are known to school to feed, for sure. Migratory behavior is often in huge numbers. I've witnessed the black tips that we see off the East Coast. I mean, there are thousands of them. Nurse sharks have always been known as a social animal. And at times of the year when it would seem reproduction is not the prime mover. So I would say finding them in large numbers is pretty easy. Lemon sharks are similar to that. The studies that have been going on in Bimini for almost 50 years have shown them to be relatively social too. And they'll stay in the areas where they're born, and then they'll move as they age a little bit. A lot of them still come back and give birth in those areas once they mature reproductively. So I think there are a lot of reasons why they're together, but nurse sharks are known for being such social animals.
Have you or any of your colleagues ever contacted aquariums to try to observe nurse shark mating behaviors in captivity?
Yes, there's a little teeny tiny aquarium up in St. Augustine called, ironically, the St. Augustine Aquarium. And they actually got in touch with me last year. They had some, what they thought, well, they had some egg cases and some other pieces of parts that they thought were egg cases. They have a couple of animals in confinement in an area smaller than what we have out here. And so I worked with them. Nothing came of it. The number of successful matings and reproduction in captivity of nurse sharks is minimal. It's countable on one hand. The Veracruz Aquarium is one. There have been a couple in Brazil. The Miami Seaquarium actually had some mating occur. And this was documented in a paper by a guy by the name of Pete Klimley, who's a biologist of some renown, works out in California. I mentioned to you that what we had seen in captive mating activities did not compare well with what we saw in the wild. And Pete's study was the one that we made the comparisons to. Before we published the first paper on this, I called Pete and I said, Pete, I'm going to publish a paper and it's going to show some behaviors that are a little bit different than what you reported. I just want you to have a heads up on it. He said, that's great. I'm glad you were able to run into this and study this. We published the paper in 1994. There hasn't been another paper on mating in the wild since. I mean, you know, again, nurse sharks are near shore in clear water where you can see it happen. Other species, not so much. Open water, deep water, dirty water. Just don't see it. Sandbars most certainly should have been observed up in Delaware Bay and the Chesapeake Bay, but you can't see your propeller from your boat. So how are you going to see this host?
Given how shallow the water is that female nurse sharks inhabit prior to mating, is there ever a problem with them getting stranded by the outgoing tide?
They're pretty clever. They're pretty smart. We've never seen a stranded nurse shark. They'll belly off the flats. You know, they keep track of tides. Again, you know, 400 million years doesn't favor folks who get it wrong. It's a fairly loose interpretation of the evolution of fishes.
Do we have any other questions from our live audience before we wrap up, or should I go through the last couple of online questions? We have a few more minutes left in our Q&A session, and I want to make sure you guys get a chance to ask any questions that you have.
Question about you. How did you end up at Albion College in Michigan?
Yeah, I'm Florida boy. Love Florida. Life was good. I was director of a marine lab in the Keys, and I've always liked teaching. I was an administrator. I didn't like the absence of teaching, so I decided that I wanted to go back into teaching full time, get out of administration. Now, for those young people who are finishing up their graduate work perhaps and are about to apply for some jobs, I'm sorry, but this is going to hurt badly. I sent out 5 letters in response to ads in Science magazine. I got 3 interviews out of those 5 letters. The first one was at Albion College. The second was at Southeastern Massachusetts University, and the third was at University of West Virginia in Morgantown. I went to Albion. I got there on a Tuesday night. I called my biology department head who I was supposed to meet. He said, well, your first meeting is at 8 o'clock in the morning at such and such a place on campus. So I went there. And I knocked on the door, a bunch of kids inside, a bunch of students. I said, excuse me, I must have the wrong room. He said, are you Dr. Carrier? I said, yeah. There's 20 students sitting in there. The first group of people I meet at Albion College for an interview were kids, were students. So I was on my way to And Albion was a one-year position, because the other two were tenure track positions. I was on my way to Massachusetts. I stopped in State College, Pennsylvania, stayed with a friend for a day or so. Got a call from Albion, offered me a job. And I thought, well, several things like, am I really making the right decision to leave the bees? This is a one-year job. I think I can even tolerate the snow for a year. But any school that'll start out with its students is a place I want to be. So 35 years later. Yeah, this it turned out obviously into a tenure track position. I wasn't an adjunct for 35 years. That was a great place. And I'm still, Zach and I are talking about some people that he knows. And one of my students is running a marine environmental education center in Broward County. And sea turtles there. And they're all over the place. And you gotta love it. And we didn't offer graduate degrees. This was an undergraduate institution. But I'm back in Florida. I knew I'd come back.
We have a couple more good questions online, and we'll try to fit these in before we hit our 8 o'clock cutoff time. Do you have any estimate of the total herd size for your study site during mating season? Any idea how many sharks are there using it?
Good question. I think the most animals we ever saw, counting adults and sub-adults, probably is between 40 and 60 in a season. That's just what we saw and we could recognize. Remember that our recognition is based on them having tags. We haven't been able to catch and tag everybody. The juvies we can get. I can get them with a cast net. I can get them with a dip net. I can jump on them. The big ones, not so much. Get them post-mating like that. And that's about the only time that we can get the big adults. So we haven't got everybody tagged.
Do females enter a trance-like state when they're mating, since sometimes they're flipped upside down?
No, the viewer is talking about tonic immobility. Of course, known that some species of sharks, when they're inverted, when they're ventral side down, will go into a state of suspended animation or stupor. We don't really see that so much. Mating activity, as you saw from the video, is pretty intense, and so there's a lot of muscle action going on there. The fact that she's inverted, she's got to be in order to get the cloaca up so that the clasper can be inserted. So I don't see anything that looks like tonic immobility. It's a wonderful question to ask, but I just don't see it. I don't see it very much in nurse sharks. And I've tagged 3,000 nurse sharks. So I don't know that I've ever seen a nurse shark relax and let me tag her. Well, it just doesn't work out that way. Any commercial fishermen who are viewing and have worked with nurse sharks know that it's terrible. They'll roll up on your gear, they'll tear up the gear. Commercial fishermen will tell you catching a nurse shark is like trying to pull a plug out of the bottom of the ocean. It's just sort of like they hang on, you can't get them up. They're terrible for wrecking gear and beating up people who catch them. So
I like to work on fish that go to sleep when you flip them upside down. Makes my job a lot easier. Have you seen any males or females that repeatedly return to the mating grounds of the dry Tortugas multiple times over the years?
Every year. And what a great question to segue into a paper we're working on right now. Because they come back so frequently, I've caught some animals 7 and 8 times. And every time they're caught, they're measured. When I tell you that a nurse shark's growth rate is 13.4 centimeters per year, take it to the bank, because that's based on measurements over their entire subadult lifetime. Now, the big adults, growth is going to plateau off. You're only going to get so big. But these small ones, the growth is absolutely linear, and it is spot on. In hopes that whoever asked that question has a bit of a statistics background, I've applied linear regression analysis to these curves. Yeah, okay, biologist. And our correlation coefficient on this, R squared, is 0.997. Okay, it doesn't get much better. That's R squared. So it's 0.999. That is linear growth. So when I tell you I've caught an animal over 8 consecutive years and its growth rate is 4 to 6 inches per year, count on it.
All right, I'm going to go through a couple more questions here real quick. These are pretty straightforward. Can you tell the age of a shark just by looking at them or measuring them?
I can make an approximation if it's a sub-adult, because I can tell you about what I expect it to grow up to that adult stage. The only way sharks can be aged is to sacrifice them cut the vertebrae, they put down growth rings. Now remember, these are cartilaginous animals, so this is real tricky. They don't have true bone. It's very difficult to visualize these rings. Some studies in the past used to inject an animal at the time of initial capture with oxytetracycline. This stains cartilage on the outside. Some of us may have grown up when they used tetracycline on our teeth or something like that. Well, as a shark grows, if its vertebrae is say an inch across, as it grows, it'll grow bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. It'll put down more rings, but you can see where that stained ring was. So you can count the number of rings, determine how many rings are put down per year, and you can age it that way. That means sacrificing an animal. And in our study, sacrificing an animal brings the study to a close.
You talked about using acoustic tracking tags to monitor movements. Are you putting any of those internally, or are you mounting them all externally?
Both, tried both. You have to make a small incision to put it internally, put it in the gut cavity, the peritoneal cavity. If we attach them externally, we're at risk because nurse sharks absolutely love to go under coral heads and they'll scrape them off. We were once asked if we wanted to get involved with satellite tracking. And I thought, what an outrageous waste of money. Put a satellite tag on an animal that's not going to move. I have the single record for tracking a nurse shark, 96 consecutive hours solo tracking in a 14-foot skiff. 96, that's 4 days, folks. Sum total of movement in 4 days, 100 yards. So that was when I gave up tracking.
And I think you'll like the final question we have from our Zoom audience. How many nurse sharks have you watched mating?
I've watched over 1,300 mating events. So that's a lot. And my research partner has gone a couple more years than I have, so he's probably up over 1,500. So that's a wonderful invitation into the bedroom of the shark to be allowed to view some of their most private moments. And it's gratifying to be welcomed into their most private moments.
All right, well, again, Jeff, thank you for coming out tonight. Thank you to my online audience. Thank you to my in-person audience. We combined between our small in-person audience and our online audience, you reached right around 200 people tonight. I know, it'd be nice to have all 200 of them here in person, but it's been great to have a small in-person audience. It's been great to hear applause again. And I just want to thank everybody for another wonderful lecture series. Unfortunately, this is our final lecture of the year. We'll be back at it again sometime next January. I promise we'll keep doing this year after year. But for all of you, whether you've been joining us online or the folks here tonight in person, I just want to thank you again. We wouldn't be able to do this without you. This is one of the things that we truly do for you, but we also do it because you allow us to do it for you. We wouldn't be able to do this if we had a small audience. By having such great turnout night after night, we're able to bring in great speakers like Dr. Carrier, and we appreciate it. So have a good one, everybody. To my online audience, thanks again. To my in-person audience, thank you again. Have a great night, everybody.